right, Jacob. I think we're ready to begin. We are rolling. All right, very good. Welcome once again to this, our final class during Blue Sky Civics, Summer Civics 2026. Tonight we're going to be talking all about Congress and redistricting issues and democratic accountability. I will tell you, as Kristen just indicated in some pre-recording comments, that while we are going to talk about the Supreme Court's recent decisions, some of you have heard me chat about this in the past. It is important to understand what they said, what they did not say. The good news coming out of this is not only do all of you graduating seniors tonight get this wonderful book from Blue Sky Waukesha, but we're also going to finish on a high note this evening with some ways of looking forward and some things that we can all do to ensure that our democracy is preserved. But before we get there, unfortunately, we need to go through a little bit of challenge here along the way. Let's talk first about the enumeration clause of the Constitution, which again, I know you think about every single morning. The enumeration clause, again, Article 1, Section 2. It was, again, in the original Constitution. This is not a part of the Bill of Rights. It says, you know what? Every 10 years, we've got to do a census. This is where it comes from. The Supreme Court has affirmed this concept repeatedly. First Congress is March 4th, 1789. You recall that was in New York City. None of us was around then at that time, but plainly Washington, D.C. as a nation's capital did not exist at that time. And it's important to note what the commission in the Constitution is all about and how the language, as Kristen was just saying, is all important. The idea is that our founding fathers said we want to count all the people in the United States of America. Not citizens, all the people. We count the citizens, but we're going to talk about anybody who is here, and that includes people who are legally here, illegally here. We want to get a count on all the human beings. And why do we do that? Because it relates to the principal topic of our discussion tonight, which is, again, drawing lines for congressional districts, but also for states. And also it has a lot to do with the apportionment of federal funds. Where the population is, a lot of that relates to the treasuries of the various agencies. And significantly, again, went back and looked at all of this. It will happen again in about 2.5, 3 years as we do another census in 2030. The federal courts have said that during the course of the census taking, and you see that it's either by a form or sometimes, yes, they go door to door. The question whether or not you're legally here, whether you're a citizen, the federal courts have repeatedly said that's not the appropriate thing for the census takers to ask. This is about people and asking about how many human beings are there. We're not asking if somebody in the back room is legally here. We're asking about the number of folks who live in this place. And so that will come up again. Do we have any doubt that someone will challenge that again and try to put in the census forms that question? It should not be there. And the courts, at least up to now, has said no. Interestingly, the 14th Amendment, which we've talked a lot about in the recent weeks, has corrected, again, that incorporation of slavery, that's a part of our Constitution, and said, no, we're now counting the whole number of persons. We're no longer doing that. 14th Amendment corrects that and also reaffirms it's all about people. And so we begin with that. And then the question is, how do we go about voting in America based upon that line drawing? You're going to get the bonus tonight of a few other cases. Some of you have heard me talk about these before. And then we're going to spend most of our time tonight talking about this major voting rights decision that, as you have also heard me talk about, changes the Voting Rights Act in America and brings it virtually to its knees. Again, not without remedy, as Kristen has already suggested. Let's talk about a couple of those early on. We were chatting about this a little bit. So there's Congressman Mike Bost. Mike Bost is a long-time congressman from Southern Illinois. He happens to be a Republican, but that doesn't matter in particular with respect to this particular litigation. In the state of Illinois, again, unlike the state of Wisconsin, if you have sent in your absentee ballot, and it was received by the clerk any time after 14 days after the election, 2 full weeks, it will still be counted. And you can imagine that from time to time that might make a difference if it's a close race. Typically it does not, but the law in the state of Illinois is 14-day grace period. And that's established by the Illinois legislature. Why? Because our Constitution says that the timing, places, and circumstances of voting is left to the states, right? It is not, Mr. President, a matter for you to make determinations about. Look at something he's done just today, seeking once again some immediate intervention by the Supreme Court. This is up to the states. Illinois says 14 days. And what happens is Mr. Bost comes forward and says that that is unconstitutional. He files a lawsuit, and he wants to proceed to challenge that law in the state of Illinois on the basis that Election Day is Election Day. And if we can't count every single ballot on Election Day, those votes that we cannot count on that day should no longer be counted, no longer a part of the process. Our own Seventh Circuit, Midwestern Nice, looks at him and says, Mr. Bost, you won the election. What is your beef here? Go back to Congress, enjoy this. They find that he's got no standing. Why? Because he won. So what is the downside? What is the monetary or other thing that he has suffered? Goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice, probably making the right decisions for reasons I'll get to in just a moment from now, says no, he's got standing. He can file this even though he won because he's got a personal stake as a candidate. And then we get two others who may strike you as strange bedfellows. You've got Elena Kagan and Amy Coney Barrett who come together to support that decision, 7-2 vote, and say, aside from the fact that just your candidacy alone gives you standing, we can identify in Mr. Bost's campaign some monetary expenditures that he made in following what happened after the election. You paid your staff, you did other things, and so it may not be a lot of money, but he did lay out some additional funds. That itself is damages in some way, and so they too acknowledge you've got a right to pursue the lawsuit. The real interesting bedfellows here are the people who supported Mr. Bost. Conservatives and liberals, everybody left to right, groups that would not normally think would be allied, are allied in supporting him. Why? Because ultimately this lawsuit stands for the proposition that if you see something in your local elections, your state elections, that you think is unconstitutional, you should have a right to sue. Whether or not you can articulate a particular damage done to you or not, that's a part of America, and that's what these members of the Supreme Court have said. And so when we go into November, if there are things, again, locally or more broadly throughout the state that need to be remedied, whether you are the ACLU or the Republican Party, anything in between that, you've got a right to sue. And so all these people came out in support of Mr. Bost, and it affirms that fundamental notion that we should indeed at least permit people to get access to the courts when they feel that the election processes in our country are not as they should be. Significant, once again, that this does not determine whether the 14-day period is right or wrong. We're going to get to that in 30 seconds, but it does say you've got a right at least to challenge it. So the Supreme Court's got a lot of cases, including another one here, and this is where they do in fact determine whether or not these grace periods are appropriate or not. This one happens to be in the state of Mississippi. There, they've got a 5-day grace period. It's not 2 weeks, 5 days, same kind of thing. If you have dropped your ballot in the mail and it doesn't get returned to the clerk until 5 days later, 6 days, you're out of luck, but up to 5 days, that will still be counted. And there, once again, there's a challenge in Mississippi, to the notion that election day means election day, and if you haven't got all of those ballots counted by that day, they should not be counted. And once again, we've got a 5-4 majority here. Interesting bedfellows, once again, including Amy Coney Barrett, who looks back in time, which is something that she normally does not like to do. She spars, as you know, with other members of the Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas in particular, but she said, we've done this for a long period of time. Civil War, we did this to ensure that people who are fighting on behalf of the Union have an opportunity to vote. World War I, World War II, and then she makes it even more current. She says, what about all those students who are away? Yes, we want them to be able to vote, and senior citizens. And so the affirmation here is by the Supreme Court, yes, indeed, a split vote. And again, the dissents, you can well imagine where those come from, are quite virulent about this notion that, yes, indeed, election day is election day. Still, those are on the losing side of the ledger here. Supreme Court telling us that these grace periods, wherever they may be around the country, are in fact constitutional. Again, I'd offer probably the right decision just because no one is suggesting that these particular votes are the product of fraud. It's all about the timing of the receipt. And yes, indeed, there's got to be a cutoff at some point, right? If you're getting these votes in a month or two afterwards, we've got to have some finality, as we saw in the national news about Milwaukee a couple of nights ago, but here the Supreme Court says, yes, you can count those votes. A good vote, the Supreme Court overall, a vote 5-4 in favor of counting legitimately cast votes. Let's do another one here before we get to the big one this evening. And this is one that's quite wonky. And again, I'm not an economist, and I don't know about advertising and about all of these kinds of things. Folks who are much affiliated with the parties on both sides would be able to do a much better job. The upshot of this is that the federal election rules have long contemplated that while you, as individuals, can contribute to an individual campaign, the reality is that parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Green Party that we were talking about before, is prohibited from making direct contributions to a candidate, okay? And so the question is, okay, how do they do that? How does the Democratic Party support a particular candidate if they want to do that? And the answer is, well, something you will know, political action groups, right? The PACs that are out there. And so the parties can, in fact, contribute large amounts of money to political action committees, and those PACs can then, in turn, contribute monies to individual campaigns. This gets complicated by virtue of the fact that the allocations between and the donations typically made by Republicans to the PACs and Democrats to the PACs and individual campaigns tend to be sort of different. The Republican monies tend to come from a smaller number of people, but larger amounts by particular campaign contributions. Democrats tend to be larger numbers of people, but smaller amounts altogether. The upshot of this is whether or not that old rule, it is now an old rule by virtue of the Supreme Court saying that can no longer stand. They find that it's a violation of the First Amendment rights of the parties. First Amendment rights, this is Citizens United kind of revisited again, human beings, right? And they find it's a violation of the right of parties to express their own views, to limit them and not being able to contribute directly to a campaign. And so they basically, with some exceptions, strike that down. And again, as you see there, you've got the author of that particular opinion basically overruling an opinion from a quarter of a century ago, which went in the opposite direction, affirming the legitimacy of this. Again, Supreme Court overturning precedent here. And you've got Brett Kavanaugh saying, hey, we're treating everybody the same. Democrats, Republicans, you're all abiding by the same rules here. And this is where, again, gets even wonkier. Because of that difference in the ways in which contributions are made, it has to do with advertising, and television advertising in particular. Because the way in which these monies, if you are contributing and getting monies individually from, individual candidates are getting monies, they can get lower advertising rates, okay? The PACs can purchase advertising, particularly on television, but only at higher rates. That too, for economic reasons that are beyond my particular explanation. What this does in the end, yes, it provides a level playing field, but because of the differences in the ways in which contributions are made, Republicans and Democrats, what it means is those monies can now go directly to individual Republican candidates and individual Democratic candidates, more purchasing power, and this is the assessment of the impact of this, among Republicans to purchase television advertising in the future. And so in the wake of this, you can anticipate, presumably into the fall and into 2028, even greater numbers, if that's possible, of advertising on both sides, but especially giving an economic benefit to Republicans because of the way that monies have traditionally been given to PACs, now being given directly to candidates who can now benefit from the lower advertising rates. If you follow all that, you're much brighter than I am because it took everything within my brain even to articulate that tonight. Suffice it to say, you've also got some members of the Supreme Court who talk about skirting contribution caps. Note once again, the concept here is coordinated party expenditures. They're indicating that because these limits no longer exist, we now have basically an open checking account for any particular candidate, and money again, which continues to flow, very easily accessible for any individual candidate, whereas before they were a bit more shielded through this PAC process. Again, a significant change, which we'll see the consequences of in the coming years. And so if that has got you a bit disturbed, hang on, because now, as Kristen said, we're going to talk more about gerrymandering, which is the major story of our time, and the Voting Rights Act and how that is implicated by the Supreme Court decision. Many of you have heard me talk about this. I think this is a fascinating historical story. That fellow is named Eldridge Gerry, Gerry. He is one of our founding fathers. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he is, among others who signed that Declaration of Independence. We think of them as being all high-minded and above politics. Oh, no. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson sometime, right? Who tried to impeach a Supreme Court justice because he didn't like his politics. Eldridge Gerry, again, among those who said, yes, America needs to be free of England, nonetheless a very, very politically animated person. And he becomes the governor after the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, effectively becomes a state. He becomes the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he goes back from his work as a founding father, and he is in a leadership position there, and he says, now, I need to get my folks, the folks who are supporting me, in positions of authority here in Boston and in other places, and so I'm going to draw some new lines here with respect to congressional districts. Again, plainly they exist because this is Massachusetts, one of our original colonies, now states, and he goes back and he draws all kinds of lines there that, again, for what it's worth, a personal note, Andover, right there, not too far from Boston, happens to be the location where my niece, my oldest sister's oldest daughter, lives with her husband and 2 children. This is not a campaign announcement, but my niece's husband is now running for Congress in Andover, okay? I won't advocate one way or another, but there it is. That's the reason why this is historically significant for the Santel Senate Co. family out there. And I often tell Dan, who is the candidate, that you're a product of gerrymandering. And he says, what? And I explain this story. So what happens is Eldridge Gerry goes back and he draws this line. And he doesn't add the fierce face and the claws and the wings. What happens is that the Boston Herald gets a hold of his redrawn lines, and they add all of that very malevolent look, and they say this is a vicious salamander that Governor Gerry has produced. And of course, he's not happy about that. He fires back and forth. And ultimately, this becomes what we know today as a gerrymander. We change his last name. It really should be a gerrymander. But it comes from what the Boston Herald did way back then in the early days of our nation because of what Governor Gerry did. And his drawing that thing, the Boston Herald described a salamander, a vicious salamander there, affecting the future of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So that's the etymological source of where we get this word. Now let's talk a bit more, not even more seriously, but about the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to give you some background on all of this, and I promise you we'll get to the all-important point, which is this decision in what I think is one of the 2 major cases coming out of the Supreme Court this term. The other one is the Slaughter case, having to do with the allocation of presidential authority over previously independent agencies. This has to do with the Voting Rights Act, as Kristen said, as we advertised tonight, and it goes right to the major issue of our time, which is gerrymandering, and how the Supreme Court has now basically, I'll read the headline to you, I'm not going to bury the lead here, basically now all bets are off. You can do basically whatever you want to do. Eldridge Gerry would be very proud of what the Supreme Court has just done. So let's go back and talk about what Lyndon Johnson did way back in 1964 and 1965. Undeniably, it bent the arms of an awful lot of Southern Democrats at the time who were opposed to the Voting Rights Act, who thought this would be a change in their environment. And Lyndon Johnson, along with many, many others responsible ultimately for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have probably seen, I was almost going to put the picture up there, Lyndon Johnson handing out pens at the time that he is signing off on this major legislation. He calls it the most significant in our history, along with the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, other things done at that time. He hands a pen to Martin Luther King Jr. at the time to indicate that we have now entered a new era in American history.
An era, again, that I'll say to you tonight has been almost completed now, closing the book on this as of a couple of weeks ago. So what does that say? Well, along the way, since that time, the Congress, plainly supporting what was done in 1965, amends the Voting Rights Act, by my count, no less than 5 times. And what are they doing? They're increasing voting accessibility. They're ensuring that all the promises of the Voting Rights Act, again, bipartisan Congresses and presidents doing all this, encouraging further voting. Ultimately, the Congress does pass in 1965 a Voting Rights Act. I'm going to tell you what Section 2 is all about, and then I'm also going to touch briefly on 4 and 5 because it describes this overall trend by the Supreme Court in bit-by-bit dismantling what was done in 1965. Section 2 is the major core aspect of the Voting Rights Act. It basically says you can't discriminate in voting based upon color and race and language. That's basically it. That's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's basically it. And the good news here, and I'll try to pepper some of that in here as well, is Section 2 is not gone. And if, for example, this past Tuesday or coming up in early November, if there is anyone out there, whether it's a clerk or someone at the polls who says, I do not want that person to vote because of their color or because they do not speak English, that can still be a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And so Section 2 is still out there, but the accessibility of it for gerrymandering and addressing the problems of our time, that's pretty much taken care of. So we also, in addition to Section 2, we also have 4 and 5, okay? Section 4 and 5, which we've chatted about in past years. I recall well that Blue Sky had an event on my backyard. Remember this, Kristen? A number of years ago when Brnovich was issued, and also even before that, a case called Shelby County versus Holder. Section 4 and 5 in the original Voting Rights Act did something dramatic, and again, bipartisan support. They went around and they said, okay, let's look at all of the districts in the United States of America, not just in the South, across the country, where there's been a history of discrimination based upon voting. These are the bad districts, so to speak, where you have done exactly that. You've done things to prevent people of color, of language, from voting. And if you've gotten that history, you will be on a list. And the list is extensive, and it's published immediately there inside the law itself. And what the law says is if you are in that list, and they could be in the South, there are places in California, in the northern areas of our nation, all around, whether you're a full state, whether you're a county, whether you're a city, a village, wherever you may be, and you've got this history of voting discrimination, you're on the list. And what does the list mean? The list means that if you want to change anything about your particular rules, if you want to change the places where people can vote, limiting them, the hours, the other circumstances where presumably people of color or language not English would not be able to otherwise vote, if you make any of those changes, before you do anything, yes, you've got to get permission from what? Yes, the pencil-necked attorneys at the U.S. Department of Justice, and they're in the voting rights section, which again, until recent years, was an active thing at the Department of Justice. And so you would say, I want to change something in Shelby County, which is in Alabama. And for the most part, the Department of Justice will look at those and say, if you're doing something benign, like you're changing the stock of the ballot or something else about the pens that you use, go ahead and do that. But if indeed you're changing the accessibility, especially for people of color, to the voting polls, then we're going to say no. And the Congress vested in the United States Department of Justice, the voting rights section, this capacity without any review to say, no, you can't do it. And that's the way the law was until 2013, 1965 to 2013, and prevented, by virtue of this self-effectuating aspect of the Voting Rights Act, the force of the VRA when it comes to affecting the intent of the Congress. And what happens is that Shelby County, which is among the many places in America, they're on the list. And they say, we're tired of this now. And we've grown up and we're doing better now than we did before. We should no longer be on this list. And they file a lawsuit in the federal court there, and they say we shouldn't be on the list. And oh, by the way, Section 4 and 5, those are old things. Those are anachronistic, and we no longer need to be concerned about that because we're now a better county. And the things that got us on the list the first time are no longer applicable. Goes up to the courts, and most of the courts say, no, the Congress said this is indefinite. And if you've got a beef, go to the United States Department of Justice and argue with them. But the law is the law, and you've got to get permission. It comes to the Supreme Court. And again, in 2013, during the time that I was the United States Attorney, Eric Holder was my boss, the United States Supreme Court says exactly what Shelby County wanted it to say. They look at this, and again, shades of things we've talked about in other areas, right? Oh, that's old. 1965, it's no longer the early portion of the 21st century. All those kinds of things no longer apply, and they find that the applicability of 4 and 5, 4 is basically the list, 5 is kind of the applicability of it, that it's unconstitutional, and they strike down sections 4 and 5. And they find that Shelby County and all of the other areas in the United States of America that previously were under the obligation to go to the U.S. Department of Justice to get permission to change their policies and practices, you're now set free. And they do within literally days, weeks, months. And it's in the wake of 2013. You may even recall this, that many jurisdictions around the country start articulating and passing rules that do in fact change the ways of voting that affect African Americans and other people of color in states and places around our nation. Now, you can still bring lawsuits under the 15th Amendment and equal protection, but under Section 4 and 5, you're no longer stopped right at the gate, and you've got to do litigation to address those kinds of things. That's Shelby County versus Holder. The good news here, of course, is that this is where the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendments and Acts of, for example, 2014 come into place. Automatically, Congress, in some sections, including John Lewis, he was alive at the time, says, we can do a fix on this. We can update the list. We can make a determination about whether or not the Shelby counties should still be on the list. We can change the applicability formula. We can address what the Supreme Court has said and reinstate this, what's called the clearance process. That legislation has been introduced in every single Congress since 2013, and you're already shaking your heads. No, you know well, this was never, ever changed. Can you do it? Yes, you can. Never changed. That's Section 4 and 5. Let's get to Section 2. Brnovich, again, I made reference to it because Blue Sky is focused on this as well. This one has to do with Section 2. And it doesn't find that Section 2 is unconstitutional, but it comes out of Arizona. And there, the legislature has done a couple of things that dramatically impact the capacity of the Native American Indian populations there, which are significant, as you know, on reservations throughout that state, and vast expanses of land, right, throughout Arizona. What is the challenge there? Well, among other things, people who are voting on the reservations, no question about the legitimacy of their vote. They're registered, they can submit their ballots, but they don't have accessibility to the spot where those ballots need to be returned, which could be 150, 200 miles away. And so there develops this practice, a word I do not like, but it's the way that the Supreme Court refers to it, is harvesting. You can go to the reservation and say, okay, I'm going to pick up all the ballots from these folks, and I'm going to return them myself to a place where they can be counted. The legislature, of course, finds out about this, and they say we're going to prohibit that practice. That if you are on a reservation, wherever you are, any place in the state of Arizona, you don't just have to be a Native American Indian, but wherever you are, if you've got an absentee ballot, you are obliged to hand deliver that to the clerk. And if you don't do that, and somebody else delivers it on your behalf, that ballot will be stricken because you're not the voter who's submitting that ballot. You can well imagine how that kind of thing inhibits dramatically the access of people, specifically Native American Indians in Arizona. That's part of the legislation. The other thing that, again, always prompts those of us, and we talked about this before, scratch our heads about this. It is curious, but the other thing that apparently happens with some frequency in Arizona is, although again we can be a practice here, if you show up at the wrong precinct and somehow you're permitted to vote, your vote, again, nobody's suggesting you're not a citizen, you haven't lived there a requisite time, you're not a felon, your vote is legitimate, but somehow it's submitted at the wrong place, likewise, that vote will be stricken. Okay, I think many times I'm seeing it again, heads nodding. What we'll try to do is say, why don't you deliver that to another place somewhere and we can make that happen. There in Arizona, they say you voted at the wrong spot and we're going to get rid of your vote. What happens is there's a challenge to both of those because once again, there's this notion that somehow, effectively, you're inhibiting great numbers of people from getting their ballots in. Goes up to the Supreme Court on a challenge that this is in violation of Section 2. Why? Because you are inhibiting the capacity of people of color, mainly a Native American population, from voting. And in the end, in Brnovich is the DA, Democratic National Committee, written by Sam Alito, the Supreme Court says those pieces of legislation are just fine. And the reason why that Brnovich case is so significant is it drops dramatically the threshold for Section 2 implications, right? If you can get away with that legislatively and prohibit people from voting, Section 2 has already been suppressed quite dramatically. There's a question right up front.
How come we can send people out to nursing homes, places like that? Tell us that's okay.
Right. So because this is a particular state law in Arizona, in Wisconsin, although I have not explored this myself, we permit that to happen. But the point of this is that if our legislature says that practice of going to nursing homes and doing things, whether it's in advance of voting or even on that day, in Arizona, they forbade that. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can prohibit that kind of activity. Your question is, again, the question was about going to nursing homes and doing the harvesting there, which we do fairly routinely here. Arizona, again, no longer. That's Section 2. And then I'm going to throw in one more thing. This is your law school for the evening, right? This is a case called Rucco versus Common Cause. You may recall this, although again it's a blip at the time, but it's become hugely important based upon what the Supreme Court has just done recently. And I hope that you smile when I report on what the Supreme Court did here. There was a challenge to pure political gerrymandering. That is, I'm going to draw lines. We're going to put race to one side for a moment, as difficult as that is to do. I'm simply going to draw lines based upon my political party. I'm going to find all the Republicans. I'm going to put them in a district. I'm going to pack them together. I'm going to crack the others and throw the Democrats away, and again, vice versa, the same with Democrats and Republicans. And I'm going to draw lines based purely on partisan interests so that my people get elected. And there was a challenge to that. It sounds kind of like raw politics, right? It sounds like the kind of thing that, well, we know that it's a tough business, but probably shouldn't happen based purely on political motivation. It goes up to the Supreme Court about whether or not purely political gerrymandering is a matter for review by the federal courts. And here's where you can smile, at least, but also note that the Chief Justice said, well, we in the Supreme Court, we do not engage in analysis of political issues. We're not political at all. And this is a politics matter, and therefore we're not going to get involved in this. And the significant thing, putting aside the language, is Supreme Court in 2019, not that long ago, says all the federal courts, the courts in the land, we are out of business when it comes to anybody challenging pure political gerrymandering. You can do whatever you want when it comes to deciding whether you want the Democrats to be cracked and packed, or Republicans, the same kind of thing. With one exception. And that's why this is so important. We'll get to this and again identify the new standard here. It was always the case that if the impact of what you did by drawing those political lines was to disenfranchise people of color or language, if the effect, the impact of what you did by drawing those lines politically was to deny people the right to vote, specifically gerrymander, that can still be prosecuted under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act until a month ago, okay? So let's talk about what happened then in Louisiana. 6-3. Yes, please, yes.
In Arizona, can they mail in their ballot?
They, again, this is back at that time. I believe that they can, but I'm pausing that a little bit because I want to check on very much encouraged by Brnovich to do other things, and that's the only reason why, Jim, I'm a little bit hesitant. Let me check on exactly what that is in Arizona, but I just don't know today. At the time, the answer is yes, so that would be an option also out there. Yes, Kristen.
If
Right, yeah. It's again, right. So even if you had that, Kristen making the point that again, just like the polling places are remote, if your post office is 150 miles away, likewise a problem. And or you get mail, once every 10 days or so. It's the same issue sort of thing. But I will check on whether or not the law itself was what it was at the time, and I'll get back to you on that. But it raises the same issue. So here again, this is Louisiana. This is Calais. So we're going to talk about what the Supreme Court did a little more than a month or so ago. 6-3, right down partisan lines. And we've got, again, the Chief Justice and the others saying that in Louisiana, where after, and I'm going to go ahead for just a minute or so, look at that third bullet point there. And then we'll also talk about that map there. What Louisiana does, they're under directions from a federal court. The population in Louisiana is about 1/3 Black, okay? And they've got 6 congressional districts. And so there's all sorts of litigation. It goes up and down all over the place. You can read yourself through that third bullet point that I've identified there. The upshot is that the legislature is directed by virtue of what Section 2 required at the time to say, you know what, if you've got a third of your population that's Black and you have only one majority Black district, that's 1/6 of your overall population, you should have 2 majority Black districts. And I always hasten to add that this is not to say that white people only vote for white candidates and Black people only vote for Black candidates, but the concept, supported by an awful lot of people who know these things much better than I do, is that by virtue of being in a majority Black district, a majority district of other races and colors, you have a greater opportunity to elect people of your shared experience, okay? And that's the reason why we talk in that language. Louisiana is told that, yes, indeed, with a 1/3 population that's Black, you need to have more than one majority Black district to ensure that they have the opportunity, at least in at least 2 districts, to send to Congress people of their particular views, shared experience. And so what they do, and this is why this is so difficult and so complicated when it comes to drawing these lines, what they do is they accomplish exactly what you see there. They create a 2nd district, if you can see that number there, and the 6th district. And yes, it goes all the way from Shreveport to Baton Rouge. And you might look at that and you say, and this is probably one of the reasons why this particular case comes to the Supreme Court, because it sort of looks like Eldridge Gary has been hard at work, right, in Louisiana doing it. It's not an attractive congressional district here. And again, it's circuitous, it's serpentine, and what happens is it's challenged, and those are the new districts there, the 2 majority Black districts. What happens is it gets challenged by people who identify themselves as white voters. Okay, and they say that by virtue of what has happened here under the 14th Amendment, equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, my right to voting has been infringed. And so then we get the Supreme Court saying no to the 2 majority Black districts. They say yes to the people who are challenging those and say that when the legislature, upon direction once again of courts, created that 2nd majority Black district, that was not only unnecessary, but to the extent that they relied upon Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, not constitutional, and it does in fact violate equal protection. And they strike down that new map that had 2 majority Black districts, reducing effectively, as you'll see in just a moment, the majority Black districts to just 1. And significant, as you'll see, but also with respect to the impact of all of that, okay? What is Sam Alito? How does he describe the fact that Section 2 no longer requires that legislators be concerned about race when it comes to these kinds of things? And equal protection does, in fact, mandate that in Louisiana, at least, they abandon that 2nd majority Black district. Look what he says. Once again, times have changed. It's no longer 1965. We've got vast social change. We in the Supreme Court, again, from my perspective, legislating here, changing policy, changing the Voting Rights Act, say that the focus again on Section 2 back in 1965, we've had great changes, particularly in the South. increased voter registration among people of color, increased representation, turnout, even increased candidacies by people of color. And for that reason, we need to change the standard under Section 2. And here's what they do. In striking down what happened in Louisiana and telling the legislators who were trying to accomplish something under Section 2 that their direction was wrong. And this is where, again, it gets a little bit wordy, but we'll walk through it together. The new law is to successfully overturn district maps. Somebody who's challenging it, once again, on the basis that there is a racial gerrymander. The new law is that you've got to show evidence, a strong inference that the lawmakers, in drawing those new lines, were specifically intending to keep people of color from voting. That they drew lines to afford minorities less opportunity because of their race, and they did that overtly, publicly, with intention and purpose. To state it differently, and this is where I had to read this 15 times to understand exactly what, but it's chock full of meaning, exactly what Alita was saying. A lawsuit that cannot disentangle race from race-neutral considerations, including politics, that's Rucho, will fail. In other words, if you draw lines and you do it based upon politics, Rucho tells us, we'll let you do that. And you can get your Republican friends, your Democratic friends into office by virtue of the way that you're drawing these lines. Used to be that if the impact of that was that we're also disenfranchising people of color, you'd be in trouble. Now, even if they're all mixed, if you've got that purpose only to draw those lines for political purposes, and you happen to have along the way the impact, the effect of disenfranchising people, and it's all entangled, that lawsuit is going to fail. Stated differently, and this is me putting this in language that, again, does Sam Alito call me up and ask me to write some of his opinions? The answer is no, nor should he, because I'm not at that level. But he says, he being me, the impact or effect of line drawing on the capacity of people of color to vote is now irrelevant. The effect of my drawing political lines, even if it keeps people of color from voting, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to tell you that I did this for political purposes, and although the impact is bad for racial purposes, I'm no longer going to be stricken down. As long as there is not evidence of express intent or purpose, and once again, someone told me the other day that maybe there will be some of this, but you'll see this in one of the states as we review this, very unlikely today. Maybe not completely out of possibility that in 2026, a legislator is going to stand up today and say, my purpose in drawing these lines is to keep people of color from voting, okay? And you have to have that kind of express intent. Maybe it's in an email to your colleague. You can get some evidence there. But the lesson of this is if you want to do that kind of racial discrimination, don't put it in writing. Don't say it out loud. And what you should say, and you'll see this in an illustration coming from one of the states in just a moment, talk about your absolute right to draw lines for political purposes. And don't mention anything about race. And if someone calls to your attention the notion that, well, your impact is to get rid of a sizable portion, you shrug your shoulders and say, gosh, I'm awfully sorry, but I can do this by virtue of the fact the Supreme Court has said I can draw lines. If there's no evidence of that express intent, you're okay. It is only when you've got that this will be problematic. And I would offer to you that the impact of that change is that now all bets are pretty much off when it comes to drawing lines. I can do whatever I want to draw politically. I will probably note what I may be doing for racial purposes, but as long as I'm not providing some evidence of my knowing intent, even if the impact is there, the district that I'm drawing, whatever they are, those get upheld. That is a huge change, and this is the reason why, going back to the next screen, you've got the dissenters saying the practical effect of this decision is to make it nearly impossible to use race in drawing lines. You're not going to be doing that at all anymore, setting back the foundational right under Section 2 that Congress established back in 1965, and the purpose of there was some racial equality in voting. no longer required under Section 2 by virtue of Calais. Kristen.
Just so everybody understands how easy this is. When we, the poor little blue sky Waukesha, we can buy the voting data for just our county, and we do. There is an incredible amount of information, so all you have to do is get your voting data. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close. These are the people that vote for Democrats, these are the people that vote for Republicans.
Find them on the map.
Find them on the map. It literally will give you a map, color coded. And you're sitting there in the probably private attorneys paid for by taxpayers.
You've got your Sharpie out.
Michael Best and Friedrich, you're sitting there and you say, that looks good. This is what we want our districts to look like. That's how easy it would be.
Right. And you can do that with impunity, as long as you're not also sending an email down to a partner that says, and oh, by the way, guess what I just did? I got rid of all those black voters, right? And even that, you're probably not going to be discovered. Kristen's point was, with all of the information that anyone, including Blue Sky Waukesha, using it obviously for good purposes, can gather now, you can draw these things. You don't have to go out there and go to clerks' offices and get individual polling information. It's accessible, Kristen, probably on this thing right here that I have next to me. And you can draw those lines. And again, the big takeaway, I know you understand this, but it's not hyperbole to repeat it. You can do that without concern about the racial impact of what you're doing. Please.
Is that voter information available publicly in all states or just?
So the question is, I'm going to send it to Kristen, is the voter information available in all states was the question. It's available here in Wisconsin, correct?
It's available in all states in various ways, but you can buy the voter data from the official voting commission in any state. The price varies widely. But that's how candidates get their voter lists. They don't buy the voter list. What we buy is not the official voter list, but it may as well be. There are other data companies that sell it.
All right, so
All of this bringing of hands and everything from the feds that the states won't give them their
yes.
voter data, that's just all politics.
A lot to unpack there, right? And so we've got virtually everything on that issue. The question is, what about getting voter lists? We've got the president, this is fascinating because it's very timely, who is asking for all the states to produce voter lists so that Homeland Security and the Postal Service, a little bit more complicated than that, can find out who should properly be voting absentee and who shouldn't. Federal district court judges, including one right in Madison, have stricken that down and said, no, the feds, you've got no ability to do that. I think but 20 cases, what I was going to tell you about a little bit later on, but the question is timely. Earlier today, the United States Department of Justice, John Sauer, the Solicitor General, filed an emergency application with the United States Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to tell all those lower courts that they're wrong, and the states that have up to now been not producing that information have got to be compelled to do it.
I think the other thing was what the Trump administration is asking for is a list with identifying like the social security numbers and driver's license.
Right, huge amount of, yeah, right, voter information. So you can describe that however you like. The good news here is, at least up until now, the federal district courts, and we'll see that in just a minute ago, they have been bulwarks in saying, no, you've got no legitimate reason to getting the kind of information that Kristen just identified, okay? And so in the wake of that, you get the point very well. The NAACP, which of course is horrified by all this, says this is the worst case scenario when it comes to Voting Rights Act, specifically respected gerrymandering, the issue of our time. Louisiana Attorney General, she is only too happy to acknowledge that indeed the Supreme Court has given her a win. She says this is seismic and it affirms equal protection. So we've got very different views coming out of that. And once again, the reason why that is there is Unfortunately, sometimes bad circumstances make bad law, and we probably have that here. But plainly, the United States Supreme Court was looking for a case like this to overturn Section 2. Brnovich was just putting the toe in the water. And now, effectively, Section 2, at least with respect to gerrymandering, all but inaccessible in terms of a remedy. And so, let's take a look at what this means. Just like in the wake of Shelby County, you had huge numbers of states running out there and saying, we're free now, we can do whatever we want. Look what happened in the days, week following Louisiana Calais. Let's begin with Louisiana, the place where this all began. That is the governor. His name is Jeff Landry. Immediately, and getting a lot of criticism for this, but he probably needed to do it. He now has a map. Approved previously by the legislature, by some federal courts. It's no longer good, according to the Supreme Court. It's been the product of an equal protection violation. So what he does immediately is he suspends everything. And look at this. Again, the point of this, as you'll see again in other slides here, is the confusion that this causes at a time of primary elections of what we just did going into November. And he says, well, you know, I got to do this. We got to uphold the rule of law, is what he says. He is plainly happy about this particular resolution. And look what he does. He changes the House party primary to November 3rd. It's an open primary now in Louisiana. And all candidates, regardless of the party, they're going to be all on the same ballot. And the absent and outright majority, the top two, are then going to be in a runoff on December 12th. Okay? That's Louisiana. That's the confusion this causes there, again, for folks who are going to be sworn in, presumably, in early January. The statewide primaries, of course, on statewide races, those proceeded, but this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the confusion that this causes and what he does. So he stops everything, almost everything from happening with respect to congressional races there. And what happens is he goes to the legislature, that's the state house there in Louisiana. And yes, they refer to it as a 200-mile snaking map, okay? And the legislation there basically reduces, they redraw a number of different things there. They reduce the 2 majority black districts down to 1 because Sam Alito and others said that they could do that. And here's the point that I was making before. Look at what the committee chair in Louisiana does to justify it. And look at what's missing from what he says. He says, you know what? We just drew these maps for political purposes. I am delighted, he says, that we will now have Republican majorities in Congress. And that's what I did because Rucho back in 2019 told me I could do that, period. What he doesn't say, of course, is anything about the impact upon racial voting in Louisiana. And sure enough, the Democrats come back and they say, they identify exactly what's missing here. You've got Senator Sam Jenkins, and he said the Republicans who've drawn these lines, they've done it with the authority of the Supreme Court under Rucho, and they've now done it in their authority under Calais, are using partisanship. I just want my people in my political party to win as a cover for discriminatory practices that keep people of racial minorities, and yes, also keep the other party out of office. This exactly, if again, you all understand this, but if the world, the country, Louisiana understands nothing more, those two statements codify exactly what the rule of law now is in America. Talk about it being politics, draw the lines based upon political animation, and you are okay. That's Louisiana. Tennessee, not to be outdone by its partner there in the South, they jump on this right away. And within days, this is the governor there, Bill Lee, who's been in the news for other reasons. He says, yeah, Calais now permits us to get rid of our 1 majority black district in our state. It happens to be right in and around Memphis. And so they do not have a district that has the salamander-like look as it is in Louisiana. And what they do in Tennessee is they say, oh, in Memphis, we're going to carve up, we're going to create 3 different districts in Memphis, and we're going to do this for political reasons. So we get the Republicans who will be the successful candidates in all of these redrawn districts. The effect of that, of course, is to crack the population of black voters in that, and also Democrats in the city of Memphis, and they do it. And the legislator there, and you see there, one of the legislators, her name is Charlene Oliver. She becomes quite animated. She is not violent, but it was such a violent oral exposition back and forth. I don't mean any physical violence, that, believe it or not, the state troopers are called in just to ensure calm when this is going on. The reaction of this is so bad. Now, again, the other lesson coming out of this is while Tennessee has a new map, no more majority black district there as well, and the city of Memphis is a gerrymandered, politically gerrymandered, racially gerrymandered district. You do have, again, the NAACP, ACLU, Democratic Party. They're going back to the core, which is a 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment saying this is violative of basic constitutional principles. They're back in court trying to get this overturned, but you've got a Supreme Court that basically says you no longer need to do it. Another question right up front, please.
Really shows what things are really like when you have to call the cops in to protect all
Yes.
white men against one black woman.
Yes, right. And she was not alone, but your point is well taken, that there was, people were angry. You see what she says there. Yes, please.
Very naive, but aren't they revolted to get it approved by their state legislature? Or, I mean, they're just going willy-nilly and changing this. I don't understand.
Right, yeah.
Beholden to anyone to just redraw the line.
Right, and so,
Secondly to that,
and that,
doesn't Wisconsin have a Fair Maps coalition that is presented to our legislature?
yes.
An independent redistricting
Mhm.
committee?
And we're going to talk about one of the other things that Kristen Blue Sky, I think, are going to be very much a part of. Lots of, at least 2 or 3 things to unpack there. What you have here is a legislature, okay, sent there, again, to the state capitol, and they get information that says, again, admittedly out of Louisiana, that says that we no longer have to be concerned about race when it comes to drawing lines. We can do this just based on political interests. And so the legislators there do it. You may be thinking about, well, don't you have to go to your constituents and say, gee, does this make sense? The answer is if you're elected there, you've got the power to vote. And you've got leadership there, including the governor. Admittedly, he signs off on this then, who says, yes, this is what we want to do. You accomplish that because, once again, the Supreme Court in these 2 cases has given you permission to do it. Hang on to your concept about other things that may remedy this. This is going to be the positive news, I promise you, in just a little while here. Hang on to that other thought because, again, it's there. Yes, please.
Going back, Kristen, when you said, people can get voting records of Democrats and Republicans, but if you don't identify with a party, then how do they know how a person's voting?
It is a guess based on where you live and other data that follows you around in your life. That's what these companies do. So they might look at your Facebook page and make it, it's very obvious that you are a liberal and they'll mark you as a Democrat.
When I post
That's
something,
why it's not perfect.
but it's, but
And I'm not giving them any information.
right. But you would agree, Kristen, that it's pretty good, it's pretty accurate based upon those indicators. May not be perfect as individuals, but if they, right, see the kinds of things that I might post, you would categorize me probably. Yes, please.
It would seem to me that in deeply Republican states where it's 2/3 Republican, this will be effective. If you have states that are more evenly divided, and now you split up the districts that are strongly Republican, it could backfire and you could lose that.
Absolutely. Again, so the rules apply across the board. And to that very good point, we did not coordinate this, did we? But look at what happens in other places. Everybody wants to get on this, right? Meet Governor Henry McMaster. He's in South Carolina, and he says, oh, let's do what Tennessee has done. And Louisiana, let's come in, and we're going to do the same thing. And what happens there is, and again, you know this fellow well, as Jim Clymer used to be the majority, or the whip in Congress. He's still there. His is the 6th district in South Carolina. It's the one majority black district. And the notion that the governor has there is, okay, we're going to get rid of that one too. And there, again, maybe not flip side of things, there what you've got are are voters coming forward, sort of consistent with your comment as well, and saying, number one, way too close, and number two, we kind of like this guy, and for that reason, there's so much pushback on what the governor does that, including even the leadership there, they all say, we're not doing this. And so it doesn't happen in South Carolina because the people said, we don't like what you're trying to do here. We don't like the notion that somehow you're playing politics, even though you can do it under Rucho. We don't like this raw politics that results in getting rid of people like that from Congress. Lots of other things related to the timing of this, some logistical hurdles, but there it doesn't happen, South Carolina. But again, you've got a governor who's sort of indicated, as to others, okay, 2026, we're not going to do this, but 2028 is coming up, right? And maybe we can get things back in order. And to that point, meet Governor Kay Ivey. She is from Alabama. And again, this is also comes out of the Supreme Court. There's another companion case in the Supreme Court. At the same time, Calais is there. Details of this, much similar. They've also got 2 majority black districts in Alabama. And of course, in the wake of Calais, the Supreme Court sends their case back to Alabama and says, read what we said in Calais. You no longer have to put together these 2 majority black districts, maybe one. And what does Kay Ivey do immediately? She says, okay, I've got a special primary election. I'm going to take these districts that are probably going to be affected as we redraw these lines for political purposes. I'm going to redraw those, and we're basically going back to our old plan that has 1 majority black district. And there, once again, you've got the Attorney General who's delighted about that. He says, for too long, those crazy federal judges have been telling us what to do, and no longer. Alabama's voters now control the federal judiciary, no longer involved. That ends today. When this is sent back from the Supreme Court to Alabama, you've got Senator Moore and the other 2 saying you've discarded a lower court ruling, again, that required that these 2 majority black districts be created there. Confusion, he's talking about things like South Carolina, and don't do this. Nonetheless, they're the losers on all this. And Alabama also getting a revised map. Let's do a little bit more inventory here. This is happening almost simultaneously, but to your very good question about Democrats and Republicans, depending upon where you are. I mean, this is an equal opportunity free-for-all now in America, right? You remember this happened. In Virginia, you have the Democrats, remember this, who created, through a referendum, a public referendum, 4 Democratic-leaning districts, right? Principally because of what was going on in Texas and California. They said, okay, we're going to send this to the people. The people vote, and the referendum says, yes, we want to create these 4 Democratic seats, okay? Public referendum. People take that to the Virginia Supreme Court. The Virginia Supreme Court overrules the referendum and says you've done that all wrong procedurally, all kinds of things. You call the legislative session, it was for budget purposes, you did voting stuff. It should have been posted by the county clerks, all kinds of procedural things, and they throw out the public referendum that would have created those 4 Democratic seats, okay? What happens, of course, is that the Democrats in Virginia, take a heavy breath here, right, because this is a lot, they then go to the United States Supreme Court, right? And in a 4-3 decision, the Supreme Court writes that we're not going to, I'm sorry, the state court finds that the legislature there did not do things properly, goes up to the Supreme Court, an emergency application here, so you've got Democrats doing this, all right? And the Virginia Attorney General there says, you've got to be kidding me. The people in Virginia voted to do this. This is a public referendum. How is it that the Virginia Supreme Court is now dismantling that? And please, Supreme Court, federal Supreme Court, tell the Virginia Supreme Court to knock it off, to reinstate that referendum. And the Supreme Court, again, on this emergency application that says you're depriving voters of what they wanted, the Commonwealth of the right to lawfully enact congressional districts, that's what they voted for. In May, 1-sentence order, the Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to get involved. No dissents were noted, but that may not mean that there was some disagreement about this. And in Virginia, again, the 4 Democratic seats are disbanded based upon what the Supreme Court here at Virginia and at the federal level decide to do. To her credit, if you will, Abigail Spanberger, she, of course, is the new governor that you know well in Virginia. She says because of all the confusion in this, we're not going to try to get this accomplished by 2026. We're going to use the 2021 map, but she, like her Republican counterparts in other states, says we may revisit this again in a couple of years because we're going to go back and address this. So that's Virginia. It's not directly related to Calais, but it's happening at the same time as Calais. And let's get back, because of course Georgia's got to be involved in everything related to voting in America, right? You don't have to, I don't have to introduce you to Governor Brian Kemp. He also says, I'm going to have a legislative session. I'm going to do what Louisiana's done and what Tennessee is doing. I'd like you to withdraw the maps. He sees the writing on the wall and he says, let's not do it for 2026. Much too much confusion, too soon. But let's do it for 2028, okay? And we've got the authority to do this under Rucho and Calais. And you get the House Speaker, and this is probably the reason why Brian Kemp backs off on 2026. He says, we need to take our time. We need to read what Calais says. We need to figure out if we can use race or not. This is indicating once again how immediately after the opinion is issued, it's more important for us to focus right now on economic matters rather than partisan games. That's, again, the state House Speaker there, kind of putting the governor in his place. And again, this inventory is changing every day virtually. I try to do some of this. By my count, again, we've got 9 states at least, including California, Florida, Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, Utah, in addition to the others, are either considering this, restyling their maps, or they've already done it. And others have deferred action, like places like South Carolina, like Georgia here. But the point of all of this is the confusion and what we have opened up to. At a time when, if we go back to that earlier slide, the contemplation was we do this, what? Every 10 years. Now, the Constitution, James Madison did not anticipate so many things that we're dealing with now in 2026. He didn't anticipate when he said you do it every 10 years. He didn't say, and you can't do it every 4 to 5 years. Now we're doing it in the middle of the decade. And we now have this new tradition, which will probably, in addition to doing it here in Wisconsin in 2.5, 3 years, if we decide after 2.5, 3 years into the 2030s we want to do it again for some reason, we can. And we can have virtually, as we're seeing right now in the weeks in the wake of Calais, all these states around the country, and I would offer to you in a nonpartisan, bipartisan, apolitical way that what has happened is now gerrymandering is kind of up for grabs. Democrats and Republicans alike can do it, and with the exception of some judges every so often saying, no, you can't, the combination of no political guardrails and no racial guardrails permit you to draw lines pretty much as you want to at this time. Questions about all that, and then we're going to continue with a few other things. Please, yes. I'm using that right. They happen to be majority black districts. The same applies. You can substitute Asian. You can substitute Latino, Hispanic. You can substitute Native American. Any population of color that is impacted by political gerrymandering, if you have an impact upon their capacity to vote, that used to be violative of Section 2, it no longer is, unless you say, I am trying to prevent people of Hispanic backgrounds from voting. So it applies across the board, and I'm using that somewhat because that it is majority black districts there, but it applies to any district, regardless of what your color, what your racial heritage may be. Good. Another question here.
My daughter lives in Virginia, and I know what she was.
Well, she kind of whipsawed, your comment is who lived in Virginia, whipsawed back and forth, right? As, yeah.
All the progressive.
But I'm just saying in the state itself, we've got four, right? And then we reversed and reversed again. So it's, and again, you may come to your own conclusion on this. Wonder out loud if this is good for democracy generally, when the uncertainty about this, confusion, and again, anticipate that this issue is not over. 2028 is coming up. Look at your watch, and we're going to start doing this across the board. Before we get to something a bit more positive, just wanted to note, yes, please, yes, yes.
I have
You are so good. It's as if we've gotten together for dinner before this, right? And talked about all this. And you did, right? And you're doing a superb job, by the way. And I will invite you and your family out to dinner this weekend. And so hang on to that for 1 second or so. Just wanted to note again this trend of giving the executive a huge amount of power. Every single term of the Supreme Court, you know about Trump versus United States, president is above the law. Last term, injunctive relief cannot be universal. This term, giving the president a huge amount of power when it comes to firing and having control over previously independent agencies. That is very troubling in terms of an overall trend. It is somewhat related to voting, but it also gives the president, again, an awful lot of sense for doing what he's doing, which is issuing more of these executive orders. And so, to the very good question that you asked right now, what are these things called independent redistricting commissions? Sometimes you'll see some of the literature on this simply talking about them being redistricting commissions. Ballotpedia, for example, does not talk about independent because that also may have some sort of a loaded purpose behind it. And the answer in Iowa, other places, we'll get to the numbers in just a moment or so. The idea is that you take this outside of all of this gerrymandering that we've just discussed, whatever the state is, California, Virginia, Alabama, and you put it in the hands of what is supposed to be an independent group of people. And I know you're already smiling. We'll get to the composition of that. The idea is you want to get rid of unfair line drawing and give it basically to a committee. I know that sounds probably scary, but basically a commission that is told to do this according to the interests of the population in the state, all right? Conducted in the open. You've got to have hearings. You've got to have public comment opportunities. You got to follow the state laws, even the federal laws. Even Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still out there. And the idea is, unlike what's happening across America, you're building trust because, frankly, you've taken it outside, for the most part, not completely, out of political hands that will draw things based upon the fact that I want all the Democrats or all the Republicans to win, and you're putting it in the hands of a commission to draw things based upon competitive elections rather than where, as often people say, you've got the voters themselves the incumbents who are choosing their voters as opposed to the opposite way. So some of the questions you're probably asking about this, what are the practical features of doing this? And yes, indeed, by my count, there are 11 states out there, and again, variations. All of them who've done this have variations on how this commission is selected. But note that there are 11 states right now that are doing this to draw congressional district lines. There are 16 states that do it to draw state lines, the Senate and the assemblies. Those numbers, if you go back and do your own analysis, I think they're pretty close. I try to do some analysis on this. But this is not a small thing, right? You've got commissions going on in America right now. You've got hybrids to all of them. They're all a little bit different how they do this. And one of the differences is, what is the composition of those commissions, right? You're going to say, well, gee, if they're all filled with the legislators, you may not get out from under this. So depending upon how you define that commission, and they're done differently. Some of them some of these commissions are intended to be and are designed to be filled with unelected, appointed citizens rather than people who are in the legislature. And again, we'll get to the selection process itself. As I said, they're supposed to be having the kinds of things you see here, open meetings around the state. You can submit comments on proposed maps. And the distinctions are, again, many, depending upon what state you're in. Some of them are exclusively non-political, and by that I don't mean that the individuals may not have their own political views, but they're composed of people who are not elected officials. They're not from the legislature at all. Some of them have hybrids. Some of them have say, okay, we'll have 3 people from the legislature, 3 Democrats, Republicans. We'll have 6 people who are not elected. And so you get all kinds of variations on this. But to your good point, the notion is that you've got trying to establish among the public a greater sense of confidence. Where do those people get selected? How do they do it? Again, a number of different varieties. And again, I've tried to capsulize here just in words. It is often decentralized, and it's so decentralized. Look at all the kinds of things that go into selecting the people who are here. Public applications. Here's the form. You want to serve on the commission? Submit your application, right? There are screening panels that look at these folks to say, okay, are you presently a felon? And maybe you should be disqualified for that reason. Some of it can be random if pulled out of a hat, if in fact we can't get, some of the appointments are split among judges and legislative leaders. All kinds of things in an attempt to try to get people on these commissions. A lot of focus on this that will eventually get it to a point where the people who are there are not animated by legislators and are not told what to do by those legislators. For what it's worth, 2015, in a case called Arizona, again, producing here some good law, state legislature versus the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, there by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court says these commissions are constitutional. You're not taking something away from the legislature that is exclusively legislative in nature. You're actually giving it back to the people to do this, and there's nothing wrong with that legally. So it's an important notion behind that. For what it's worth, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion affirming the capacity of states to do this. And again, to the good questions that are out there, if you got a legislature in the state of Wisconsin, just like Iowa, other places around the country, that says, yeah, we like to put this together, will there be fights about the composition, what they can do, how are we going to get these people? Sure, but you've got all kinds of patterns out there. You can pick and choose, and you can come to some results. You could do this in the state of Wisconsin, and I know that Kristen and Blue Sky is on top of anticipating that this may be a major issue coming into the new Senate and the new Assembly here. The pools, again, would be vetted. You've got lots of checks and balances. The idea is you're taking it outside of the political process. And then, again, I'm saying you don't have to worry about Calais and Rucho, but you're doing it based upon people who are sitting down. I may have a difference of opinion with respect to the person across the table from me, but presumably because I'm not running for election, my term is to put this together and leave. You don't have that same kind of pressure. It's got a lot to commend it. The disagreement about this was just that you're not subject to review by elective process, and if in fact you get a series of line drawing maps that people don't like, what do? You could throw the commission out, but their work is already done. It's not the elective process. That's the principal criticism of this. But they're legal, and you can, in fact, do them, including right here in the state of Wisconsin, okay? A few more things, and then we'll finish and take some questions as well. I've said this in the past, and this is why we begin to get, that's a positive thing, right, that we can do out there. Here are the other things that you've heard me say here repeatedly. There are reasons to be encouraged about what's going on in America right now. Federal district court judges who are still out there, as late as, again, Massachusetts, not too long ago, telling the President of the United States of America that he cannot, in fact, issue these executive orders that change the ways in which states do absentee ballots. The Supreme Court may tell us otherwise soon, but 20 judges are doing that, many other things. You've got federal grand juries, as you well know, in the criminal setting. Although we do not see their work on a regular basis, they do that in privacy. We know that in Washington, D.C., Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. attorney there, is not being successful in getting Congresspeople indicted and people who are throwing sandwiches at members of the federal law enforcement, getting them indicted. Although they're making another attempt, the fellow who was simply leaning, the Olympian who was leaning down into the reflecting pool, who got indicted, and eventually, again, gets reversed, and that one gets dismissed. All these kinds of things happening because of what grand juries are saying no to when they're seeing cases that do not, in fact, rise to the level of probable cause. Individual civil servants, we see this across the board. Some of them, many of them leaving and saying, ethically, I can no longer do this. I would offer to you that that is a good statement to make. At the same time, you also lose people inside government, right, who may be the bastions. There are great numbers of people, I suspect, in the Department of Justice, other places, whose names we do not know right now, who are fighting every day. And maybe at some point they say, I've had enough and I can't compromise myself anymore, but they're still there. And they're civil servants and they are pushing back on these things. And the one that is depicted there, we do this here in Wisconsin, and whatever your advocacy is, I'll identify 2 ways in which I think these have been successful. Not completely, but successful. You get out there and you let your government know First Amendment stuff, that you're not happy with what's going on. You know that a lot of the detention centers in places around the country have been withdrawn, are not going ahead with construction with those. Why? Because people in communities went out in the streets and said, not in my neighborhood. And the federal government said, we're not going to do this. The reason why the detention centers are there, of course, is because the great numbers of people who are being arrested, question about whether or not being given the due process that they need, all sorts of things. That's one area where, again, people said no. The other one, and I know it's a very mixed bag, and I know it applies also now here in Milwaukee, but the kinds of things that we saw in Portland, in Chicago, and in San Diego, and Los Angeles, this extraordinarily heavy-handed situation. Once again, I know people are being arrested, and I know that there is still an awful lot of pushback, but it's a significant thing when the Border Patrol chief says, we made a mistake in Minneapolis. We're not going to do that kind of thing again. And you'd like to think that when some of the federal judges say you can't just bust people's doors down, you have to have a reasonable suspicion before you arrest them, that that's just having effect because the people said we're not going to permit you to take people from our community without those basic standards in place. Question right down here.
You hear about those new electric gloves that they're issuing?
We've got electric gloves, okay? I have not, but okay, right. So again, right, whatever the latest mechanism is, and again, they are creative, those kinds of things, you bring them into federal court. And it has to do with, again, the dispute that's going on right now. We've got a federal lawsuit about whether or not the Milwaukee ordinance that prohibits federal agents from being masked, that, again, is going on. So all these things get challenged, a lot of that because the people of the communities are saying no, and federal judges, for the most part, saying no as well. Please.
No, your third bullet where it talks about civil servants declining to abide by illegal or unethical workers. What about the attorneys that are engaging in it? What about the bar association?
Oh, absolutely. What about the attorneys, the lawyers, right? So a couple of things there. You do have a great number of attorneys who have, again, this is, it breaks my intellectual heart, if you will, if there's such a thing, that the Department of Justice has been decimated by good people that I worked with. I know their names, and they have left not only the Civil Rights Division, the Voting Rights Section, but other places, even like the Torts Branch and the Federal Programs Branch, defending all these things. They have said, I cannot stand up and lie to federal judges, and they leave. Well, and so that, right, so that's the second portion of this. You've got federal judges who are saying and calling them out on this, Judge Boasberg, others around the country who are calling the Department of Justice lawyers. We could spend a lot of time. I could give you all sorts of examples on this, including those 238 people who were shipped off to El Salvador. That's Judge Boasberg, who basically held contempt proceedings because he feels he was told, was lied to about the process that those folks were given. They're not only being referred to bar authorities, but judges are finding them in contempt. And they're asking that the lawyers show up, again, multiple in many, many instances. And again, are referrals being made to bar associations? You bet they are. And again, is it a violation for me to stand up? I was in front of 2 circuit court judges, some very contested hearings this morning, uncomfortable things. I lie to a state court judge and my license should be taken away from me, even if I need to tell something to that judge about something that's not favorable to my position. When a judge asks me a question, I answer honestly. I may be an advocate for some other things, and there's nothing wrong with that. We have got federal attorneys, U.S. Department of Justice, to your very good point, who are relying on it's called the presumption of regularity. You probably have seen this. And judges more and more are saying, I no longer give you the benefit of what used to be there when, frankly, people in my tenure, many, many other people at the same time would walk in and say, Your Honor, I will represent to you as an officer of the court that this is the fact.
This is an agent from the FBI who will also swear this to be the case. And you know what? Federal judges will look at it and may say, Mr. Santel, I'm going to rely upon the accuracy of what you're saying. Turns out it never happened to me, but turns out that I've lied to a judge. You wait and see that not only will the warrant be withdrawn, but I will be in contempt proceedings and I'll be referred to the bar. That is now what's happening. And so they are getting in trouble, and all you need to do is look online, and probably not all of them, and judges are bemoaning the fact that they can no longer depend upon federal Justice Department attorneys to tell them the truth. Oh my.
Can't absolve them, but if they're disbarred, that's a whole different ballgame.
It's an entirely different ballgame. If you're no longer licensed to practice law, the president does not have the capacity to overturn, although, once again, promised I'd be more positive than this. One of the things that the president, the newly confirmed attorney general, is trying to do is to usurp the authority of bar authorities in states and say, we will take care of all of those people. You stay away from our federal lawyers. Now, are they going to be successful? More lawsuits? You bet, coming from just that. But that's because he recognizes that the people who are in the Department of Justice are doing this, wants to protect them in some way. Pardons, again, it's not a crime. Well, it could be a crime, depending upon what you say. But the Bar Association is apart from anything that a president or an attorney general can do. And that's the reason why he's saying, you stay away, we'll take care of it. Not successfully up to this point. Great point. But again, there are an awful lot of people who are saying, I don't want to get to that point. I'm leaving. When my supervisor says to me, you go and you tell them something that you know is not true, the answer is, I either don't do that or I leave. Yes, please. There is something called civil contempt and there's criminal contempt. It has to do with the circumstances under which the contempt is in front of the judge or just known generally. I could give you an hour long. I've never gone down this road myself. Y'all be pleased to know. But judges can, in fact, jail attorneys who are in criminal contempt of their orders. Typically, it's until they purge themselves, they come forward and say, okay, I'll give you the information. That's another part of this. Sometimes the Department of Justice attorneys are saying, Your Honor, we're not providing you with the information that you're asking us for. Okay, I'm going to put you in, I'm going to tell the marshal to lock you up for a while until you give me that information. They do have the authority. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary remedy, but they've got that capacity to do it. There are ways of pushing back on all of this, and I'm going to tell you some things that you all know. And that is 82 days from now, we're electing a new Congress. As I said before, all those things with respect to voting rights that we talked about on Brnovich, on Shelby County, on Calais, all of those, the good news is they can be fixed legislatively. You can go back and say, okay, Chief Justice, if you think that these are all anachronistic, we can update them, whether it's Shelby County, we can do a new or Brnovich, we can redescribe Section 2, we can provide specific authorities for legislatures to act and not act. You can do all kinds of things. This is basically the John Lewis Reform Act of, and then you fill in the year. And it's introduced all the time, depending upon who you send to Congress. Whoever that is, can be Republicans and Democrats who understand what is happening now with voting. They have the capacity to change it. Yes, indeed, a president has to sign off on that legislation unless it is veto-proof. Unless you get so many people in the Congress who say, you know what, the president's veto on this will not stand. Tremendous power 82 days from now to change a lot of this. 142 days. We talked about the first Congress in 1789. Have the 120th Congress in our nation's history going to be sworn in on a Saturday, the 2nd of January, coming up in the not too distant future. And notice once again, you know this well, House of Representatives, you need 218 people to pass legislation. The stuff that we continue to do with budgets and all these other matters, you get enough people there, you can, again, design budgets that are reasonable and do not have to be fly-specked in the way that we are, and we can pass them in a timely way. Senate, again, a simple majority to pass things, but you know well about this, about the filibuster there, 60 votes. You can change that, right? You can change it if you want to, but also if you get 60 people in the United States Senate, regardless of their party, who are willing to vote to change some of this, you can invoke cloture there and end the filibuster. Reconciliation process is also there. Are things you can do legislatively to address much of what we talked about. Right now, it has basically brought the Voting Rights Act to its knees, as the dissenters have said, but not without remedies before the United States Congress. And again, even if it doesn't happen, there is no statute of limitations on changing and repassing a Voting Rights Act of 2031. And reinvigorating all of this to put it back in place if there is the will to do just that. Those of you who are here at the wonderful largesse of Blue Sky Waukesha get a graduation gift tonight. And that comes from the board and from Kristen, the president, and I will simply say, again, we can take more questions. What a delight it has been to be with you again for this series of 6. I thank Kristen, I thank the board and all of you for letting me be a part of your lives and hopefully providing some information that helps you, informs your own decision-making process going forward. An absolute delight, an absolute honor to be with you, and I thank you so very much for all of that.